Welcome to the second episode of the Discord.net bot development series. In this episode I want to go through a few basics and actually start coding our Discord bot. But before we actually start coding, I want to talk about a few basics in C#. There will be a little hint towards when you can skip if you already know these basics, but for starters let's actually start going through the basics. First thing you see here is two quotation marks containing a few words. Now what this basically is a string. I can use this, for example, when I say that we're gonna say something or run a function and it contains a string. So for example, if I say, hey, we're now gonna write a string, I simply mean using two quotation marks to put some text between them. Like this. These are both strings, as you can see, and they're very simple. The second thing we're going to use a lot in C# are semicolons. Now, semicolons, we use them, for example, when we're at the end of a function, like this, when we say console.writeLine, and then we also make a string, and then say this is a string, and then we use a semicolon. However, we don't always use a semicolon at the end of our line. For example, when we have an if statement, if for example true, then we use a curly bracket and then we do something in this. For example, console.writeLine, this is a string, and then a semicolon. Now as you can see, I didn't use a semicolon here and I didn't use a semicolon here. However, there are also a few cases in which you might do need to use a semicolon after a curly bracket, but that is not yet now. Let's go to the next symbol, and that is a colon. Now a colon is not something we're going to use a lot in C#, but for example when I say that we're just going to type this is a colon, then I just simply mean this. Another thing we're going to use are square brackets, and they simply look like this. We can put something in between square brackets in C#, or for example put a few strings in them like this, and that basically means that it's an array. So when I mean an array, I mean this, but when I mean square brackets, then I just mean these two. Another thing we also have are normal brackets, and you've already seen the brackets because for example here we use brackets. So brackets we mostly use to, for example, call a function like this. We use brackets, and in between these two brackets we put a string. We also have brace or curly brackets, and in these tutorials we will be calling them curly brackets. Now curly brackets, you've also seen these before in this example, for example when we use an if statement. So when we say for example if true, then we have a curly bracket and a closing curly bracket, and then in between we put a nice function. Now we also have pointy brackets, and pointy brackets are sometimes used to define a return type. Now this gets a bit complicated, so I'm not going to talk much about it, but just understand that when I talk about pointy brackets, I just mean these two symbols. And last but not least, we have a lambda expression, which just means an equal sign and a pointy bracket to the right. Now we have gone through the basics, and I hope you can understand these few symbols. If you need to have a list, there will be one in the description containing all symbols and their individual names, so you can just follow these along. In the meanwhile, the most symbols that we're going to use, you can find them in this file, so you can also just take a screenshot if you'd like that. Let's actually start coding. In the previous episode we installed Visual Studio Community. Let's actually open the program. Now when you've opened Visual Studio, click on create a new project and select console.app.net core. It might also appear here, and if it doesn't appear here, just type in console app, hit enter, and click on the one that actually says console app.net core, and then click next. Here we can actually give our project a name. For the tutorials, we will just be calling it a tutorial project. Click on create to actually create the project, and now we are going to witness the first few lines of code. Now this is a very simple hello world program, but we're gonna make a few adjustments. The first one is that we're actually gonna install the Discord library. Now what is a library? That's a good question. A library is simply something that we use, and it actually makes our lives a bit easier, because we are not the only developer developers in the world, there are also millions of other developers that actually help us. A library is something that has been made by someone else that helps us to not repeat a lot of functions. For example, if we want to send a message to Discord, instead of making very long functions that do that manually, we can just use the Discord.net library. Let's actually download it. Go to Tools, go to NuGet Package Manager and click on Manage NuGet for Solution. In NuGet, we can actually install any form of library that we want. Make sure to click on Browse and then in this search bar, search for Discord.net. Now the first few libraries that we're going to use is Discord.net, so just install that one. And when you install a library for the first time from a publisher, it's going to ask you for permission. As you can see, it asks me to accept the license for Discord.net, and I click on I accept. After accepting the license, you can install other libraries without accepting the license again. We will be needing Discord.net, Discord.net.WebSocket, Discord.net.commands, and Discord.net core. Now if you've installed these 4 libraries, let's start coding. Go to your program and instead of using these things, we're going to make a few adjustments. The first adjustment that you're going to make is add in the top bar, we want to use another library. And to add libraries to use, we simply use using. And then we call the library that we want to use. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to add system.threading.tasks. Because we are going to make task, and for that we need the task library. So let's go here and make another adjustment. Instead of doing this, we don't want just something to pop out in our console, we're gonna do something else. We want first to change our static void to a public static async task. Now, async simply means that something else won't happen when another function is running. For example, when I use await and then a function, then if I use another line, for example this line, 911, won't execute until this has actually been done. Instead of using this, we're going to use a lambda expression. Remember the equal sign and the pointy bracket to the right. Now we're going to use await because we don't want it to stop until something is finished. And we're going to call startup.run async and then args. Now it is very normal that you're going to get an error. You're going to get an error right here. It's going to say the name startup does not exist in the current context. And that is correct because we're going to make a new file. New files can be made in the Solution Explorer. To create a new class, which is something we need, we can right click on the name of our project right here and click on add and click on class. We're going to call our class the startup. You will see that if the class has successfully been created, that now we have a startup.cs file right here. And if we go back to our program, the startup is now green and now we have a red line right here. That's okay. Let's go to startup.cs. Now before we continue, we need to add 2 more libraries. We're going to go back to NuGet Package Manager, manage NuGet packages for solution, and now we're going to search for extensions.dependency injection. Now you're going to see here Microsoft.extensions.dependency injection, and that is exactly the library we want. Click on install and this will basically install our dependency injection library. You will again have a message asking you to accept the license of Microsoft. Just click on I accept. Another library we need is extensions.configuration. Search for this library, click on this one, Microsoft.extensions.configuration, and hit install. You will again need to accept the license, just accept it. The last thing we need, so we actually need 3 libraries, is netescapades.configuration.yaml, and you can see that I've used it before. Just click it, click on here, and click install. This library will be used to make a nice config file which we will be using to put our token in. Go back to startup and actually let's start making the startup. Now we want to start with changing this normal class to a public class. And in this new public class startup, we want to make a public iConfiguration root configuration. And then we want to use an opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket, and then in between these two use get. Now you might be asking what we will be using this for. That is very simple. We're going to use this variable to pass our configuration, and our configuration will exist out of our prefix and our token. Now let's make a new line and start with public startup string array args. As you can see here, these are two square brackets, and this basically means that we have a string array. Now use a curly bracket, make a new line, and in this let's start with a variable, and a variable basically means that we can call something multiple times without needing to repeat something. For example, you could do var hello is by, and instead of now saying console.writeLine by, we can now simply use hello, and this will print this string that we just defined. Now let's keep going, and instead of using var hello, we're going to use var builder. We're going to say equals new configuration builder, and then use a opening bracket and a closing bracket. Now click enter and use a dot and say set base path app context dot base directory, and then say add a YAML file and then a string config.yml, and now we use a semicolon. And the last line, configuration equals builder.build. Now you might be asking what's going on here, and it is very simple. What we just said is that this is a builder, and it's going to build us our config, and it says it's going to use the path, the app context.base directory, which is basically the bin folder that will appear here later, and it's going in that, and then it's going to use the config.yml file. Last but not least, we say that configuration, which is the variable we defined here, is going to be builder.build. So we can later call this to get the configuration that is made in config.yml. Now let's make a new line and say public static async task run async, and then a string array of args. Now we want to use a curly bracket, and before we continue, you see that these things are now red. Hover over them with your mouse, click on the light bulb and click on using system threading tasks. Now you see that this is green. When something is green on the line, it means that there is a warning but not an error. Try to keep warnings away, although when running something with a warning, it probably won't crash your application. Now within this, let's say var startup equals new startup and then args, and then we're going to say startup.start async. Now let me explain what we just did. We created a kind of class and we created a task. Now in this task we say that startup equals a new startup with arguments. This means that we created this guy over here and we provided it with our arguments. Now after we set await startup.start async. And basically startup now means that we can call everything that is between these two curly brackets. Now start async is not a function that we have defined yet, but we will be using it later. Also, before we continue, I just realized that I made a little typo. Instead of saying run async, I said run async. So let's change that to run async and save it. And if we now go back to our program, you can actually see that we have no errors right here. This is a great sign, and we are making some good progress. Let's go back to our startup and actually start making the function that's going to run our bot. We start by saying public async task run async. We use curly brackets and we say var services equals new service collection, and then we use two brackets. Now we say configure services, which is a function we will make, and then services and a semicolon. Now we say var provider equals services.build service provider, and then provider.get required service, and now we're going to use the pointy brackets and then say command handler, and we use brackets and a semicolon. Now we're going to say await provider dot get required service startup service and then brackets, start async, and other brackets. And then last but not least, await task.delay -1. Now again, what did I just do? Before we continue, by the way, let me explain why we use static. We use static to call this function in other files. For example, in program we call startup.runAsync. But if we would try to change this function, you can see that there is only runAsync and not, for example, startup or run async or whatever. What I mean that there is no run async is that if we go here, we have to provide arguments. You can see here that we have to provide arguments string args, while in this function we don't provide any arguments. So if we would remove static here and we go back here, then you can actually see that there are no functions at all. So let's undo that real quick. Let's save it and let's undo this here. And now if it's now static, we can actually call it. Now on this line, what we did here is also very simple. We created a service collection and later we will create a function for the service collection, which is gonna define a few options which we can use for example, saying if commands should be case sensitive. After we said var provider is services.build service provider. The service provider is something that we can use to, for example, pass our command handler to, which is exactly what we do here. And last but not least, we give the service provider our startup service, which will log in our bot. But that is something we will do later. And last but not least, we say await task.delay -1. This basically means that the task will just keep running infinite amount long. This is also why we use await and then startup.startAsync. And as I am now going over this, I made another mistake. Instead of using start async, we're going to use run async, because that's the function we just made here. Alright, let's go further. We're going to create a private void and then configure services iService collection services. Now, why iService collection? That's a good question, because we're going to pass in the services, which is the service collection. Now we're going to use brackets. I'm going to say services.add singleton, then new Discord socket client, and then a new Discord socket config. And now we use curly brackets and we open them up. And now here are a few things we can say. The first thing we're going to say is log level is log severity and then verbose. This basically means that we are going to get a lot of logging info if we would like. For example, if something goes bad or if something goes south, we're going to get a notification of that. And last, we're going to say message cache size is 1000, but that's not everything. We're also going to add another singleton, which is a new command service. And you might be wondering, why a new command service? Well, great question, because the command service goes about all our commands. So through the command service, we will be creating our commands. Now we use curly brackets again, and we're going to say log level is log severity dot verbose. We use a comma and we say default run mode equals run mode not asynchronous. This basically means that everything will run async, meaning that it's going to wait before a function ends, just like we did here with the wait and the async tasks. And last but not least, and this is optional and we can adjust this later too, but we're going to say case sensitive commands equals false. Now you can adjust this to your liking. You could, for example, say true, but this means that if we say that a command should be executed as, for example, this, like ping, then if you would use the command as ping, then the command won't work. Only this way it will work. So for the tutorial, I'm going to leave that off because I don't like it, but you can enable it if you like it. Now we're going to use another singleton, which is our command handler, which we're going to make in a second. We're going to add another singleton, which is our startup service. And we're going to add our singleton of the configuration. And for that we use brackets, not pointy brackets. So we just say configuration There we go. And then we use a semicolon because that's the end. Okay, so what did we just do? Good question. We provided a few settings that we want to enable, disable, and that kind of stuff. Now the services is basically a collection of services that is going to check all our Discord things, and it's going to make sure that messages don't go over a cache of 1,000 messages. So what this does is when you use a channel, you can set a cache, and this means that it will not go over 1,000 messages when you, for example, get all the messages from a channel. That's also what it says here. Gets or sets the number of messages per channel that should be kept in cache, and when you use this as 0, it will not cache anything. Now another thing we set is the log level, and the log level, I tried to explain it earlier, but it basically means that how much information we want to get. We also set default run mode is async, which is just to run everything asynchronous, and the last thing is the case sensitive commands is false. Now you could also look into other functions. There's like a lot of things that you can define here, but we are just going to stick with these 3 options and here with the 2 options. And after we also set add singleton command handler in the startup service, this basically means that it also needs to listen to our command handler and our startup service. And last but not least, we added our configuration. Now before we move on, let's actually make our configuration file. So go to your Solution Explorer, click on add, and say new item. Now here we can add a lot of files, but please just search for text and then use a text file, and we're going to call it our underscore config.yml and then add. Now in this file we can define a few variables which we want to use later. We use configuration files, so for example when we use passwords or things that we use a lot, we can just put them in configuration files so we don't need to call them every single time. So for example here we're just going to say prefix and then a colon and then a single quotation marks. We're going to say exclamation mark and then tokens, which is going to be Discord, and then here we can put our Discord token. Now let's actually get our Discord token from our bot. So a very simple way to do this is go to your browser and go to discord.com/developer/applications, go to your application, click on bot, click on copy, and this basically will give you the token for your Discord bot. Paste it in here, and now you can actually start using your bot and logging in. But before we do that, we actually need to make the thing able to log in. So we need to make our startup service and our command handler. So let's go here and create a new folder, which is very simple. Add new folder. We're going to call it services, and in this folder we're going to create a new class which is going to be called startup service. Add this file, and now we have a great startup service. In this startup service we're going to make the class public again, and we're going to define a few variables. We're going to say public static service provider, then private read-only Discord socket client underscore Discord. We're going to say private read-only command service commands, and last but not least, private read-only configuration root, and that's going to be underscore config. Now right here we're going to say public startup service, and we're going to say service provider, Discord socket client, Discord command service, commands, and configuration root config. Now use curly brackets to open this and say underscore provider equals provider, and a semicolon, config equals config, semicolon, Discord equals Discord, semicolon, and last but not least, commands equals commands. Now let's create a task that is actually going to sign in and actually going to run our bot. So let's create a task, public async task start async, and let's open it. Let's use curly brackets, And we also need to use our system threading tasks again, so let's add that here. And now in here we're going to say that our string token equals config, and then between two square brackets we can say tokens and then Discord. Now this is a nice thing about the configuration root. If we use this, so underscore config, which we defined here and here, we can actually use tokens and then Discord. So if we use this, then the string token will actually be this, which is very nice. Now what we can say is if this string is null or empty and then token, then we want to give an error because we do not want the token to be empty, otherwise the bot won't work. So here we're going to say console.writeLine. We need to define a string, so we're going to say please provide your Discord token in underscore config.yml. And then let's not forget we need to return. And return basically means that the task will stop, and this prevents everything that we have under this if statement to run. This is a very nice way because if we do this, then the program will quit and nothing will happen. Now let's actually sign in our Discord bot. We're gonna say await underscore discord.login async, and then we're gonna say token type dot bot, and we're going to say token because that's our Discord token. Now after we can say await underscore discord dot start async, and this actually starts our bot. Now we're going to say await underscore commands dot add modules async, and then assembly dot, oh it should be uppercase A, assembly dot get entry assembly, like that, and then a comma, and then underscore provider, and then a closing bracket. Now we get an error at assembly, but just click on the light bulb and using system reflection. This will fix the error. And that is actually it. Now we need to make one more thing, that is our command handler. So go to the services folder, right click it, click on add, click on class, and make a command handler. Let's start by in this class, again making it public, and in this class we're going to say public command handler, and then Discord socket client Discord command service commands iConfiguration root config and iService provider. And now the same thing what we did earlier at the startup service, we are gonna need these three things. So just copy these and paste them in here. However, instead of making them private and read-only, we're gonna make every single one of them public and static. So just copy that and paste it in front of these things. Now what we're gonna do inside here is exactly the same as what we did in startup service, so we can just copy and paste it right over here. And now we're actually gonna make an event that is gonna tell us on which bot we are signed in. So let's create a new line, and we're gonna say underscore Discord, and then we're gonna say ready. Now as you can see, there is a light bulb on the left side of the name, and this basically means that what we have selected is an event. Now there are many events. If you click on the dot, you can see a lot of events that we can work with, a lot of light bulbs, and later we're going to use a few of them, but you can use whichever one you want. For now we're just going to use ready. Now here it's becoming interesting. Instead of just using equals, we're going to use a plus equals and then on ready. Now why do we use plus equals and why don't we use brackets, you might ask? Great question. By using plus equals, we just tell it to use this function or method, and it will pass the arguments for us without us needing to do it. Just click on the light bulb and click on generate method. This will create a method, and as you can see, the error is now gone. In this method we can do a few nice things that we like. For example, we can now say console.writeLine And then what we're going to do here is we're going to say connected as, and then we're going to say lowercase discord dot current user dot username, and then a hashtag, and then we're going to use the curly brackets again. We're going to say underscore discord current user dot discriminator. Now, what did we just do? Good question, and I'll explain it to you. What we did is we console right lined this, but that's not everything we did. We added the dollar sign. Why did we do that, you might ask? Great question. You can use a dollar sign before a quotation mark to tell that we can actually use variables in a string. So instead of doing, for example, hello, and then plus name, and then plus another string, blah blah blah, we can just use it like this. We can just say dollar sign hello, and then between brackets we can just say name, and we can use a closing bracket, and we can say there, which is way easier and more efficient than the method we used before. So just remove this line, and as you can see, we can just use it this way. Now, another thing you might have noticed is current user. What is that? Well, actually it's pretty self-explanatory. Current user is basically the current user, the one we are connected to, so our bot. And last but not least, what is discriminator? Discriminator is basically the hashtag of the user, but in C# or in any Discord library we call it discriminator, and it also states here gets the per username unique ID for this user. Now, it's still red, so there's still one error, and the error is not all code paths return a value. Well, this is basically what happens when we don't run something asynchronous. Here you see, we don't have an async somewhere. So what we need to do is we need to tell, hey, we're done, because just a bracket doesn't do that. We need to say return task dot completed task. This lets our program know that, hey, we're done, and we can just use this. So now we're actually ready, we can save all our code, and let's actually fix these errors. The errors originate from startup, and there's a very simple reason why. Because it has no idea where to look for the command handler in the startup service. So just hover over them and you're gonna read the error, the name type or namespace name command handler could not be found. It doesn't know where to look for these files or these classes. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna say using tutorial.services, and this magically fixes our errors. Now, why does that fix our errors? Good question. Do you see how here it's namespace.tutorial, but if we go to in our command handler, it is namespace tutorial.services, and in our startup service, it's also tutorial.services. This basically means that it looks into the folder services instead of just in this folder where there's also the program and the startup. Because these, startup and program, are both in the namespace tutorial. So using tutorial.services tells the program to look in these two files. And this now works. Alright, let's make one more little change. We set something in our startup class. We told it to look into the app-context.base directory. While in the base directory there currently is nothing, because we still need to pass the config file. Right click the config file, click on properties, and click on copy to output directory, and click on copy always. Now hit save, run the program, open Discord, and see how magically your bot turns on. And if you look into your console, it also now tells us connected as tutorial #8733. Alright guys, that's it for today. In this episode you have learned a few basics, and I can promise you that in the following episodes stuff will get a lot easier. Today we really had to go a bit deep into configuration and Discord socket client and service provider, service collections, and a lot more stuff. But from now on things are going to get easier, and we are going to make a great Discord bot. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next episode.